Okay, we are on to the final assembly points of this transfer case. Now you see this is your gear selector or your four-wheel selector, which has already been installed, and here, I'm not sure if I can give you a good angle, but here are the new O-rings that I put in to seal it. I won't be taking this apart again, but I'll try to put in some footage so you can see how I put it in. Now, beginning from this part, again, I'll put a footage where I put this star gear thingy with a lot of teeth on it, where the rotationary gizmos sit on after assembly. This is also a time that I'll learn if there is something like too much silicone. In you go, little gear thingy. On these guys. Okay, these bolts are tightened good enough. This is a thick thrust washer, so you put it down first. This is your thrust bearing, you put it second. This is your input shaft. This is where the transmission connects to, so you put that in next, all the way. Now originally this thing only had this thrust bearing, which is made out of plastic. But when I looked at the manual for the input shaft, it shows that it has a thrust bearing, not a thrust washer. Yeah, see, this thing has actually a thrust bearing in the manual, but mine didn't come with one, but the kit came with one, so I'm just gonna use that in its stead. Next up is this. It has 4 gears. I'm pretty sure it has a fancy name. And here is the new thrust washer that I put on. You gotta line it up with these. So put it on, wiggle with these until it snaps in place. Yep, there it is. So this one is in. Now on top of this, you will be putting your big round gear selector thingy, which is this guy. Now this is your shift fork. I replaced these. It goes like such. This part attaches to your gear selector, so have your gear selector positioned like this with the screw at the bottom so this can rest easily. You will need to play with it until it seats. There. Now that thing is in. Okay, so let's put the snap ring back in. When you're putting this in, you don't need the snap ring plier. Not all the time you gotta make sure it is seated in, and then slowly make your way around it like so. At the very end you may need to give it a little tap or just some flexing so it seats like that. So the snap ring is now in. Now on to the input shaft. Before the input shaft can go in though, we have to put this and then on top of this comes this. This is part of your selector assembly. Onto this comes this guy. Into it goes the spring, like so. Okay, another voiceover. So here we are going through how to assemble the free-floating needle bearings that sit under your sliding clutch and on top of the output shaft. So this is one of those lost footages that I talked about without the audio, so I'm doing a voiceover on top of the video you're seeing here. So to do this, first you need to apply a healthy dose of grease onto the output shaft where the needle bearings are going to sit, and then assemble them one by one, all 120 of them, 60 in a row and 60 in the other row. And word of caution, in my case there were not enough new bearings out of the rebuild kit, so I had to use some of my old ones to fill in the gaps. So again, save your old stuff. The other thing I should warn you about is to do this outside of your case, because as you will see me here, while assembling this, I actually drop 2 needle bearings one at a time into the case. So if you drop it, you need to take it out, because if you don't, then it will get chewed in between the gears and mess up your transfer case. So I had to take this apart twice now, and that was not fun. Then I came to the realization it's much easier to do it outside, because one, if you drop it, you can just simply pick it up from the floor or the table, whatever you have you, and two, things go much faster because you don't have too many obstructions in the way. Once you are done assembling all 120 of them, you simply put some lubrication on your sliding clutch and slide it over the needle bearings and put the shaft into the housing as a whole piece. And that way, life is much easier. Live and learn. Then comes our input or output shaft. This goes to your rear wheel eventually. So now is the tricky part. You gotta make sure this guy doesn't move too much, the sliding clutch, because if it does, you're in trouble. Okay, so it has to go through the sun gear. Now, so this bottom portion will rest in that thrust bearing, and this will go inside the sun gear. Two things, these have to line up with these. I'll get it out of the way. These have to line up with these, while these have to line up with these. So it may get a little tricky, so you'll have to finesse your way around. So before I put the spring in, let me position this so that it can go through, because you have to make sure that this thing will mate. If necessary, because this will have to move along when needed. So That's one thing you need to be wary of. So take it back. Put the spring and put it back. Like so. Okay, so one thing you wanna make sure is this thing is free flowing, which it isn't. So that means this cannot move. Even though it looks like it's seated, it did not seat. So now we have to find that spot where this thing can move up. So when you are shifting from two-wheel drive to four-wheel drive, this thing won't bind. You can see the sliding clutch in action. There, see? Now it's seated all the way because it can move. When you leave it, there. Let it seat. Oh yeah, I forgot. Two things have to happen here. When you put this in, you gotta make sure this assembly can freely move on your sliding clutch. Because as you are shifting from two-wheel drive to four-wheel drive, these mechanisms will move. I don't know how they will move, but they will move. So when you're assembling this, make sure there is free play here. And you shouldn't let this go because the spring will push the clutch up. So get this gear so it can weigh it down. Put it down like so, and now it won't move. Next up is our snap ring that we'll put in place. So get the thrust washer first, and here is your snap ring. My advice to you, if you don't want to clean the case and everything, just do this in a day if you can, or 2 days at most. So everything will be fresh in your memory and you won't have to suffer as much. You can start assembling the same day pretty much, as long as you have the right tools. Now this assembly will likely be a little painful if you have not, or somebody has not touched this in 30 some years it has been in use, but again. Okay, so next goes this one. That's your seal. So next up is this part. Now the kit did not come with the thick washers for this part. It only had thin washers remaining, and I looked at my old photos and I realized something is off. And I also looked at the manual, and you can see it has thrust washers and thrust bearings here. Now, thick thrust washer and thin thrust washer, like so. So there are two types. There's the thick one, there's the thin one. Again, the kit only came apparently with just one thick one, which is down there. But yeah, on this side you need to use your old thrust washers, so don't lose them. And this is an old thrust bearing because the kit again didn't come with all. So these transfer cases were made for multiple manufacturers. GM has their own variety, Ford has their own variety, so I don't know what they based the kit on, but apparently it's not fitting everything. So anyways, this is your front shaft. This goes to the front wheels and you slide it like so, and it should rotate freely on those thrust bearings. Now we are almost there. Now this is a new chain. It is a good idea to change your chain when you are doing this, because your chain can stretch over time, and since you're already here, it is good investment, because you don't have to repeat this process just to change your chain later. It's only about $100, so do it as preventative maintenance. Your chain might still be okay, but you know, chains like to get loose over time, and you run the risk of breaking it or skipping gear when you're in four-wheel drive if your chain is not in good condition. So there goes the chain. Now we have another snap ring that goes here. Okay, there's that. It's not seated yet. Okay, we might get a little help from our good old plier to give it that final push. Okay, there's that one. Didn't snap in place yet. There. This one is in too. So now in this case, again, 3 component thin thrust washer goes first. Thrust bearing, thick thrust washer. Save your old thrust washers, people, because you may need them like I did. So this part is done. This is your oil pump gear. It goes over like so. On top of this will go your Speedo gear. As you can see, mine is all chewed up from the years of use. So what this does is, when your Speedo gear rotates, it will skip a tooth. So if you're experiencing wobbling in your odometer or in your gauge cluster, in your speed, that means your gear is most likely chewed. Because in these old cars, even in some of the newer ones, newer meaning early 1990s, most of your speedometers are driven by a gear, either in your transmission or, if you have a four-wheel drive, in your transfer case. And for some reason they don't make this out of metal. I'm assuming because it's more expensive. Plastic is cheaper to make, and over time they may degrade like this. And when the other portion, which connects to this, goes over these edges, you will have jumps in your Speedo needle. So I ordered a new one. If you remember, I showed you the original Speedo gear was all chewed up. This is a replacement one, and I don't think this is made by Ford, because these, even though you can, or I could find the ones for other manufacturers like GM, Chevy or whatever, the Ford ones were out of stock everywhere. There was no new old stock to be found, so if you can find one, consider yourself lucky. But here is how people count teeth on these. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tooth. The original one is an 8 tooth. This one that I found is this guy, American Hot Rod Solutions. He has a store on eBay, and as of today there is still availability of these aftermarket Speedo gears. Now this Speedo gear is coupled with this drive gear that attaches to your speedometer, And when you couple this one, which is I think it's a 7 teeth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, this is a 7 teeth one, and it will be off because the 8 teeth one originally was made for this Bronco with a 3.0 rear axle or rear axle ratio. However, as most of you know, when you upgrade your tire size, which in this case it is 31s on this one, your speedo will be off. Because it is mechanically driven, there is no way to adjust it unless you change these gears. So this is kind of a blessing in disguise, I assume, for my case, because I need to upgrade the rear end to 3.7 in this one because the 3.0 cannot turn these tires. It's having a hard time turning them as it is. So once I change this Speedo gear, drive gear, and the cable gear, and upgrade the rears to 370s with the 31-inch tire size, this will actually work perfectly. But there is a way to calculate how off your speedo will be, and you can look online for those calculations, but basically you need to know what your tire size is and then what your rear end is. And of course you need to know the ratio between this guy and this guy. So this is our oil pump gear. So once that's in, this is in, this one snaps in place, and to secure this in place we need our final snap ring, which will go around this guy. So this one is in there. Let's make sure. Yep, everything is in. This is locked in place, it's not moving anymore. Good.